Welcome to the Dragon's Den. I'm your venerable host Orochi, and today we are going to continue our discussion slightly tangentially from last week in why casters are bad, and it ties into one of the core concepts that Pathfinder 2 is built on, which I find slightly problematic, but not entirely. It could have been better worked around. I think you could still save some of it by just adding new pieces to the game, but I don't think they really want to go in that direction. And the problem is one of basically the two core designs of the way Pathfinder was built is that one, it is a player facing system, meaning everything, all the mechanics are based around you being an adventurer in this world. There's no simulationist aspect to this. This is not, none of the rules in the game are built to give you any sort of immersion into a living, working, breathing world, which for a lot of people is, I would imagine anyway, because it is for me, a massive problem. Because if your rules and your physical laws of existence do not incorporate and make you feel immersed into a world, then what the fuck are they doing? Because that is, as far as I'm concerned, that is the point of a role-playing game, is to get immersed in the world you are playing in. It is the whole reason why 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons has had so many problems from older players that are like, hey, cool, could you stop fucking supporting Forgotten Realms for all of your shit? What about all of these other worlds that you had previously made? And there's a non-insignificant number of people who are just like, I don't care about the one world you're supporting. I like all these other settings. And so if your rules don't support settings at all and being immersed in them, then what the fuck is the point? Because early on in D&D's history, that was the point, is to play in these worlds. The mechanics, even in like 1st and 2nd edition, didn't do a fantastic job of immersing you, but the rules were so light that being immersed was just part of getting into it. That was just what you did. Because you're a fantasy nerd. That's what you want. Your escapism is pretending you're being in this world. Like, I understand that there's a lot of pushback of, and there always has been for many, many decades now, that, oh, you're getting too into it, blah, 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 escapism, blah, blah, blah. It's like, escapism's fine. It has been documented. I don't know if people have actually done like research on it, but a lot of people have noticed the benefits of role playing for just being a psychological tool to help people work through their problems. Like, that is a thing that like good role playing groups can do. And that is part of what good escapism is about. It's not just, hey, I hate my life, I want to live somewhere else. That can be a thing for some people, but for some people, it's just like, I need to blow off steam, or I have these unresolved issues that I need to work out. And this is a good, safe, and healthy way to work out those problems, especially if it's in a group that is a friend group and has known each other for a long time. There's just a lot of options for doing cool stuff there, and immersion is the core of how that works. If you are not immersed in the world and in what your characters are doing and capable of, and having everything have logical reasoning for why it works, then things can kind of fall apart. And Pathfinder 2 has a problem with that. It's moderately easy to overlook it, but it is part of the design that the mechanics are player facing, not built for immersion at all, which is for a balance perspective, because the game tries to be balanced, it's like, well, that's how you have to do it. You can't try to be simulationist and expect any balance, because it's not. Life isn't balanced at all. And you can kind of look at second edition D&D and like third edition D&D and first edition Pathfinder and see this is more simulationist, and it was a fucking mess. No balance, tons of interesting stuff, but the interesting stuff that was logically supposed to be, you know, hey, if you're bigger and stronger, you're better. And if you have magic, then, well, you can just reshape reality so you're better. That's how the system works, because it was kind of simulationist. And that's not good for balance. But I think there has to be a healthy middle somewhere. But I don't think 5th edition or Pathfinder 2 gets anywhere close to that, which is unfortunate. And the second core principle of the way Pathfinder 2 is built from the ground up is that you are part of a party. Period. Full stop. That is the way that the rules of the game, and thus the rules of the world, are built, is that you are part of a 4-person party. And this is why casters are pigeonholed into being support characters, because if you could blast on your own or CC on your own and win fights, then why the fuck is anybody else there? It's that mentality from a lot of jaded 3rd edition and Pathfinder 1 players who I guess were very vocal in the playtest, that they're like, oh, if casters can do everything, then why does anybody else need to exist? And it's like, cool, casters don't need to be able to do everything, but they should be able to survive on their own. Otherwise, how do you start adventuring? Like, that is my big problem, is that with a group set design, because you can look at a lot of different aspects in Pathfinder 2, and the reason why it is this way is because you're supposed to be part of a group, which I think is more irritating to me than the fact that immersion was never taken into account into the build, because there's a good reason for that, for balance, which is fine. Like, a balanced game is far more enjoyable to play as when you can just jump in, make any character, and know that, hey, I can't really fuck this character up as long as I follow, you know, the baseline, which I made a video on what's the baseline for making a proper character, and it's pretty friggin' easy. The bar is pretty low on, you know, minimum viability as a character. And also, as a GM, it's pretty easy to tweak the difficulty on stuff because you have so much control, which is like the third thing that Pathfinder was built around. It's to be very accommodating for GMs. As a balanced system with lots of modular ability, it's just really good to run. It's easy to run, and you can change stuff without doing a whole lot of math or prep work, really, which is fantastic. But the whole idea that you have to be in a group just to function really limits the capacity of a lot of classes, most notably casters. And I think that's sort of like it really ruins a lot of stories. Like, that should be the first and foremost thing that any role-playing system does, is take a look at what kind of stories can we tell? What kind of adventures can people get up to in our system? And at any point in a single character's life throughout their adventure, does our rules allow them to express themselves and really engage, have the player engage in their character's story properly? And I think the group dynamic doesn't really do that. It's sort of a little bit too video gamey, mechanic-y. And I don't think that you need to ruin that to enable single play, which is why it's so bizarre to me that they went so hard with enabling the group dynamic, and yet in certain ways didn't go far enough. So like the group dynamic in Pathfinder 2 is like caught in this middle zone where it's not really good. It doesn't have a lot of good group mechanics, but it has a lot of group limitations, which is really bizarre to me. Because when you look at casters, you're like, okay, well, they've got low defenses across the board. When most of the time when you say low defenses, people just assume, oh, you mean AC? Well, they can get their AC up to martial levels. Yes, eventually they can, if they pump their decks. But they also have shit saves, shit health. Across the board, your defenses are lower than a martial character. So being on your own versus monsters are generally built to emulate fighters who are the best at hitting things. They have a +2 to hit above all other classes with whatever their chosen weapon types are. Most monsters, whatever their prime weapon is, whether it's, a bite attack or a sword that they wield, they will have fighter progression with that primary attack. If they have a lot of other attacks, they might be less chance to hit on them, but they always have at least one attack that has fighter progression. So when you think, okay, that's +2 to hit over what you would expect to hit for a martial. But then casters are also easier to hit than that. So that means instead of just being +2 versus a martial, monsters are generally going to be +3 to +5 against a caster. They will wreck casters hard. And that prevents you from really being able to solo. And so you think about most people's story isn't going to be, hey, I walked into a tavern and joined a group. It's like that's a mercenary setup. Like most characters aren't mercenaries. Like it's cool to play a mercenary campaign. I have several of them in mind I would like to run at some point. But that whole everybody groups up somewhere and joins a party kind of start isn't very immersive as far as I'm concerned. And, it's a big trope that everybody makes fun of. It's like, oh, everybody met up at a tavern. It's like meeting up at level 1 before the adventure begins is sort of a really nonsensical sort of mechanic that people just assume is in the game. It's like, oh, well, you have to group up at level 1 to start your adventure. It's like, but you look at your character's backstory and their background and where they're coming from. It's like, does all of that suggest that they're going to immediately group up with other people? For some characters, sure. But for a lot of others, it's going to be like, no, they're going to have to find themselves in a situation doing the thing that they want to do where they're like, oh, yeah, this is too difficult for me. I'm going to need some help here. But in the world of Pathfinder 2, that's how it is for everyone all the time. It's like marshals can probably get away with fighting like -2 or -3, creatures that are multiple levels lower than you. They could probably get away with doing that and do decently. But casters, not likely. Even like a -3 enemy is going to be risky for you to try and solo. Like, you'd probably win against something -3, but like a -2 or a monster that's -1 to you, it's like there's probably a lot of monsters that'll be -1 to you that would probably kick your ass as a caster. And I really don't think that's healthy, because it just seems like most characters they have a goal. Like, they have a reason. The hero's journey is that something sparked your journey. something happened to you or something changed your life forever where set you off on this course where bam, you're now an adventurer. You might not know it or realize it, but something sent you out away from wherever you lived, whatever you were doing, even if you were like a nomad or a traveler or whatever. It set you off on this other course where now you are an adventurer. You are getting into encounters with bad people, monsters, and traps, and all this other stuff. That is your life now. And for a lot of people, they'll be doing that alone because the thing that happened to them might not have happened to everybody. And, you know, when you can make stories where, oh, everyone lived in this quaint little village and then it was destroyed by raiders, so the 4 survivors are in a group together. It's like, that's cool. If that's the story you want to tell, then that's awesome. But for a lot of people, a lot of characters aren't going to have that convenient of a story. And so the idea that you're on your own personal quest doing these things and that quite literally almost anything you run into will fucking kill you, like that immediately puts you at this sort of disadvantage where it's like no one would ever adventure. Maybe that's kind of the reason why the Pathfinder Society in-game exists. Because if you have something you want to do, then you would join the Pathfinder Society. But the Pathfinder Society is just supposed to be like explorers and stuff. That's their primary goal. So if you just have this personal goal that doesn't really line up with that, like, you know, maybe you want to kill the person who killed your parents, or, you know, saved a loved one who was captured and none of the local, you know, law enforcement can do anything about it, or 1,000 other things that doesn't have to do with any of the sort of groups you would get into contact to maybe join other adventurers. Like, all of that is going to be you going off on your own and dying because the mechanics of the game just don't support you having a personal goal, which I think is a massive problem, especially for casters. I haven't tested it, but the fact that casters are so much weaker than other characters, just there's got to be a massive difference in effectiveness for a party of casters, so that you could easily extrapolate that a single caster would have little to no chance unless against much, much weaker enemies. And even then, like, as a solo caster, when you look at what the spells do and everything, like, what does your round by round combat look like? Are you ever going to spend 2 actions to cast slow on something to lose its 1 action most of the time? Like, the vast majority of spells are built with you being a support character and 3 other characters being able to capitalize on you spending 2 actions to do a thing, which is really bad. It's why, for me specifically, most spells feel absolutely garbage because you yourself cannot capitalize on most of them unless enemies like fail or crit fail, which, when you look at the way the math works, isn't most of the time. Then you cast a spell and it almost does nothing because there's nobody else there to capitalize on it. And so I think, you know, a lot of the effect spells could have been stronger. Like, instead of just lasting 1 turn, they could have at least lasted 2 turns as a base, just so that a solo caster would have a reason, an ability to get some use out of even their basic spells when they're saved against. And so, like, a lot of the problems with casters stems from this group design where you're supposed to be the support for a group, which is fine. Like, when you think about the quintessential D&D party, even from first and second edition, it's like, oh, well, you're going to have a fighter as your front line. You're going to have your rogue slash skill monkey, and somebody's going to be the face of the group, and somebody's going to be the caster. Usually the healer is also the face, and the wizard is your caster. That's your quintessential 4-man party group, which was decent in first and second edition. It was a decent thing to go with and all that. But now that we have so many extra classes in both 5th edition and Pathfinder 2, that doesn't work at all because people don't really have specific roles that they're trying to fill, and a lot of the time people don't want to make good parties. It's a boon to any group to be a player that's like, yes, I will let me know what everyone else is playing, and then I will select from my list of characters I want to play which one fits into that group. That's kind of the reason why I tend to have like 10 to 40 characters I'm willing to play at any one time. Because I'm like, yes, I have characters to fit the vast majority of groups I could be in. But sometimes you just really want to play one character, and they might not fit into the group dynamics that are going on. I think that's not a bad thing at all. In fact, I sort of wish that the game had doubled down on making like a lot of group synergy, because there isn't a lot of group synergy. Like, there's a lot of loose synergy, like, a fighter who takes knockdown attack is really great, and they benefit from it, because they're going to knock something down, and then they got attack of opportunity, so when that creature tries to get up, they can hit it. If you have a whole group that's based around, knocking something down and taking advantage of that, then that's a ton of cool synergy in that. But there's not a whole lot of things like that in the game. They exist here and there, sprinkled around, but there's not a ton of it, and it's not really hard built into any of the classes, except one. The one class in Pathfinder 2 that is built completely around synergy, the champion. And the thing that they get that is synergistic with nearly every group, you can actually take by multi-classing into champion, and that is the champion's reaction, which is whenever you're within 15 feet of an ally and they take damage from something, you can use your reaction to lower that damage by a non-insignificant amount. And that makes it so that, enemies don't want to attack your allies because you're going to be just constantly lowering the damage that the allies take. And this is where Champion is better at using that reaction than any other class, because they also have the best defense in the game, because they have the highest proficiency with armor. So they will have higher AC than anybody else, especially if you're using a shield. And they also have a lot of feats that are great for shields, so they really specialize in being uncrackable walls of defense. As far as, Pathfinder allows. You're not going to be unhittable. You're not going to be unkillable. You're still going to be taking damage, but you can lower that damage significantly round by round. And so then enemies have to go, I can either attack the guy who's harder to hit and who's going to shield block and reduce my damage, or I can attack one of his allies who he's going to reduce that damage anyway. But at least the ally will be easier to hit. But oh no, every champion reaction also comes with an additional benefit dependent upon what the champion's alignment is. And so you can easily build parties around that reaction to get the most out of it, to make it really difficult for enemies to disincentivize them from attacking allies, and make it so that they're like, well, shit, I can't really get hits off on these other characters. I gotta go for this guy who's really hard to take down first. And that creates so much opportunity for synergy because they have this ability, and it also ties in very well with their class and their feats and all the kinds of builds you can do with them. No other class in the game comes anywhere near having that sort of synergy, and I don't understand why. Maybe it's because we just don't have any other defender classes that fill that, super tanky defender role, but I don't think you would have to fill that role just to have a lot of synergy. Like, it's here and there, but it should be all over the place. Like, every class should have, as a staple, some sort of synergistic trait. Something that they have that they bring to every group that you can build around. Every class should have that as a staple. And I think then you could make lots of really interesting parties based around seeing what classes' synergies work well together so that you can maximize group effectiveness. Because otherwise, the only way to make an effective group in Pathfinder 2 is just have a good tank, preferably a champion, have one or two characters who specialize in intimidate, so you can always have -1, -2 to all enemy stats, well, all their rolls and DCs, just to make everything against them easier, and then also knock them down so you can get that circumstance bonus, or at least flat-foot them for the circumstance bonus. And that's basically it. It's a numbers game. You find the ways to force the numbers into a benefit for your party, and that's sort of the limit of synergy. And that's cool. It makes the game easier, and you sort of have to work for it and build for it a little bit. But I find it boring as fuck, and there's no flavor for it. You could make 10 different parties that accomplish this goal, and they will look nothing alike, but they'll do it in the exact same way. And I think that is bland and homogenous and the worst aspects of the things that people didn't like from previous edition of D&D. So I really wish that classes had synergistic abilities that just really stood out as the core of the class. Like, you look at Fighter, the core of their class is that they got a +2 to hit. It would have been better if it was, a +2 to hit and maybe some sort of, maybe all their attacks had deadly or fatal if they were, doing pack tactics with another ally or something like that. Just something that made it so that you would have to interact with allies to get a benefit. And more preferably that it was an active ability instead of passive abilities. Because especially with the way I build characters, like, I'm always looking to stack passives because active abilities are generally really bad. Like, you look at all of the daily abilities, the once a day stuff in Pathfinder 2, and they're pretty terrible. Like, almost all of them universally are really, really bad. And so it's this group dynamic where you have to fit into these roles, but then they didn't give each class a way to shine at performing that role other than, hey, they do damage, and they do it by just spamming attacks or anything. There's no synergistic stuff. Like, the Ranger has one feat they can take, which is really cool, that allows them to aid with ranged attacks, and they can be pretty damn good at that. It's like, that is cool. That means, like, you're actively distracting enemies while also shooting at them for damage. That's fantastic. It's sort of passive because it just works all the time while you're shooting, but it's still pretty good. I wish there was a little bit more for it, like to actively pin enemies down and that sort of stuff. And you get a little bit of that here and there with martial abilities, but they don't like inherently synergize with other stuff. They just do basic levels of things like, oh, you do damage or you increase your chance to hit and that sort of stuff. And all the classes could have been designed better by having cool synergistic abilities built into them from the ground up so that you can fulfill your role, but you can even be better at it while you're in a team. And then when you're not in a team and not using your synergistic abilities, they should have made all the classes baseline be able to solo. And then you could have the best of both worlds, because you should be able to solo and also be able to do really cool stuff as part of a group. Because otherwise, the game sort of feels like, what was it, Final Fantasy XI? The first online Final Fantasy? Like, I hated playing that game because you could only solo up to like level 5 or 6. Depending upon your class, you could maybe get to 8 or 9, but by the time you hit level 10, the enemies started to scale exponentially in strength, so you had to group up because they were unsolable. All enemies started becoming group enemies because they had 5 times as much health and like 2 or 3 times as much damage. And that just sucks. That feels bad. That's not enjoyable to play. So I think that's a very core problem for this. And what really hurts is that you look at the way that they write their stories for second edition. They're stories that are based in this system, and they do not work. And I would suggest going to their blog and finding all of their stories for these characters, because they're really good. Like, these are really cool stories. Because this one's from the Summoner Iconic, where I think the Summoner is probably one of the best classes to solo with, because you have a pet that can actually do a proper job at tanking while you do your thing. And so this story is vaguely feasible, but she casts a spell twice, which is like literally half her spells for the whole day. So thinking you're gonna do that on every encounter is like, that's not really feasible at all. But for a cool one-time story, it's pretty good. But then we move on to other stuff. And this is the story of the Barbarian Iconic, and she's roaming around and going back to her hometown or whatever that she was banished from, finds these kids that are sort of banished, but not really. They're running from home because everything's gotten, really bad since the Barbarian went against everything and really made a mess of stuff. So now everyone's gone, crazy. Really, ultra fundamentalism kind of stuff. Like, really bad small town kind of vibes. But the idea is that these 2 other characters are probably lower level than her and weaker than her. And so that must mean that, if she was fighting anything around her level, the kids would die quickly, even though, they can sort of handle their own. But she's adventuring by herself, and she runs into some Puritans, or at least a mother Puritan who has cubs in the area. And the idea that she could run across something like this on her own, it's like, if it was +1 to her, or even at her level, she would have a hard time fighting it. A barbarian would probably do better than a lot of other classes, but if she was a lower damage martial, like a rogue, or any caster, then wandering around in the mountains by herself would be a death sentence. Like, unless, the gods, aka the GM, whoever's telling the story, specifically makes it so that you don't fight anything at or above your level, then, but that's not realistic. If you're just wandering out in the wilderness, that's not realistic that you won't come across stronger stuff. And because of the way the mechanics in Pathfinder 2 work, something that's +1 or +2 to you is going to be a really difficult challenge that you're probably not going to win. You're probably going to die to them. That's how it's built. That you're supposed to only have a 50% chance to win against something that is your level, because monsters are supposed to be of similar strength to characters. But that doesn't really work when different characters can be of vastly different strength. Like, that's one of the reasons why I stopped playing 5e's, because you can make characters that are so dramatically different in their power level that it's almost nonsensical. You can have a character who can solo every fight that's thrown at you, and then two other characters who can't even handle those fights as a duo, or even with a third person sometimes. Like, there's just so much difference in power level, whereas it's much closer in Pathfinder 2, but I do think that people complaining in the playtest for it that they wanted spell slots instead of whatever system was being suggested at the time absolutely catastrophically ruined their attempt at balancing the game, because it's not. Casters are not balanced. Even if you accept that all their spells are fine and statistically their defenses and all that stuff are fine, just the fact that they have spell slots makes them inferior in every way, because Pathfinder 2 is designed that you go into every single fight at full strength, and as a caster you cannot do that if you ever expend a spell slot. Period. End of story. So it's really, really bad and doesn't really mesh with how they're telling their stories. Like Wrecker's Reunion. This is the story of how the orc inventor, he was a different class, I think, and they, because old iconics are kind of turning into new things just to fit in with the new system and stuff, but he becomes an inventor, and he gets separated from everybody else, and in the third section of the story, he comes across some slavers and he engages them. It's like, well, you don't have a way to judge other people's strength in game. You can't just look at somebody and know, oh, they're lower level than I am, I should be able to take them. Going into a fight against multiple opponents is, especially in Pathfinder 2, is extremely risky, and there's really no reason you should think you're going to survive that. No matter how confident you are in your abilities, like if any one of them is 2 levels higher than you, even if they seem incompetent or whatever, it's just because they're a higher level than you, they're going to have more hit points, more chance to hit you, you're going to have less chance to hit them. Like, just the way the mechanics of the game work make it so that soloing is a really, really bad idea. Because even as a group, fighting anything that's higher level than you can be difficult. But at least as a group, you can suddenly determine, oh, this fight is too difficult. Let the tank take a couple hits while everyone else starts running away, and then the tank can start running away. Because at least they can take some hits, because they're designed to do that. Whereas if a caster gets into a fight and they're like, oh, I can't handle this, it's like, well, it's too late. By the time you figure that out, you're already dead. And then the whole backstory of this character is that, you know, they're trying to uncover evil in around the areas they live, because they've glimpsed behind the veil and seen the evil that's there, and now they're hunting it down and stuff. And it's like, you know, that's an amazingly iconic kind of thing, like Constantine, like Supernatural. Like, that whole Monster Hunter thing is super iconic, but doing that sort of stuff in Pathfinder, unless you can be assured by your GM that everything you're going to come across is lower level than you, is almost assuredly a death sentence. Because even if you're in a group of 4 and you come up across stuff that's much higher level than you, like, hopefully the worst that's happened is one person's going to die and the rest get away. That's at least an option. Whereas if you're solo, it's like, well, you just die. You don't save anybody. You don't make a heroic sacrifice for anybody. You just die. And I don't think there's any need for that. There's no reason for any character class to not be able to solo. There's just not. Because there's plenty of stories that are being told of characters soloing. And having the mechanics actively work against you in many different ways just really doesn't feel well. And I think only in a group of 4, and specifically leaning heavily into your role as a support caster, do casters ever really feel good. Like, there's some niche builds you can do where it makes you feel like you're doing some damage and being effective and stuff, but you could, as I said in the caster video, you can count up the number of hits it takes your martial characters to kill stuff, and if you're not changing that, then you're not doing anything, no matter how much damage you're doing. Like, a lot of people think that AoE damage is good, and it's like, it's mostly useless. Like, oh, it's good for against lower level enemies. It's like, cool, so are martial hits, because they're gonna crit. But definitely being a soloist should be completely viable, and then all the classes should be built with cool group mechanics just to work together. And I think that'd be more fun and more balanced. But yeah, that's some of my core problems with Pathfinder 2. A lot of times you can go through playing the game without really running into those issues, but once you really dig into it, like I do, because I love dissecting stuff, I love the idea of design, and so I love taking things apart and figuring out how to put them together again and maybe improve stuff. And you can look at the way skills are designed in Pathfinder 2 to really drive home the problem of this group design. Because as a group of 4 people, you're supposed to split all your skills up to cover as many bases as possible. In theory, that's good, because, you know, you want people to specialize in different things. But when you think about it, each character can only get legendary in 3 skills, unless you are a rogue or an investigator. They get twice as many, which is crazy powerful. But your average character can only max out 3. And there are, I think 16 skills? So even if you spread out perfectly so that there are no overlapping skills whatsoever in your party, you still cannot have all of them. But when I look at a character, when I build a character, I try to think, what does this character need as skills to survive in the world? What sort of things are they naturally inclined to, and what sort of things do they need to survive? Because having no athletics or acrobatics on your character at all, I think is asking for your character to get pushed around, pinned down, and beaten the crap out of. And also, you come across a chasm or whatever, and you're like, well, I can't get over this. It's like, well, what do you mean? It's like, well, I have no athletics. I literally can't jump 5 feet, so how are we getting over this? And unless your GM is very pervasive, there's literally no way. You'd have to cast like the jump spell or something to get over a tiny crevasse or up a wall, and that's not good. And there's a bunch of other things too. It's like every character should have diplomacy trained, and maybe a couple points into it, because the idea that one character in your party is the face and they do all the talking is stupid. I understand that it's a big trope and it's something, when you min-max your party effectiveness, that's what you want. You want the character who is best at talking to people to talk to people. That just makes logical sense. But when you're thinking about immersion, I make sure that every character in the party gets a chance to talk during any social stuff, because you want to include everybody, because that's just good gameplay. And so if 3 of your characters have no points in diplomacy and they're trying to talk to people, then you're like, well, I can't have you roll on this because you're just going to fail, because that's the way the game is designed. And so looking at skills, the group design really hurts making characters that are fully fleshed out to be people who just live in this world. Because it's like, what happens if one character in the group, because of things that happen or whatever, they decide they want to leave the group? Sure, as a meta event, that's not really going to ever happen. Like, if a player has to leave the group, then the character has to leave the group. But what happens if a player is like, well, my character's not starting to feel uncomfortable in this group, that it's getting too far away from their ideals and it's become unreconcilable, and so they want to leave this group? Then that character should be built so that they can do that and adventure on their own, because that's a story. That's how stories work. You might not always be with the same adventuring group your entire life. That's completely understandable. But that's not how any of the mechanics work. And as a meta aspect, sure, that's probably not something that's ever going to happen. But I think having it so that everything about your game disincentivizes making characters who, you would want to tell their whole life story, not just their story with this group, I think is really bad. That's more aversion to immersion. And I love immersion. So having all these things that are really anti-immersive hurts the overall system, even if most of the time you can get around them. I think that they could have easily just made it so that you get more skill bumps. Like, even if you don't get multiple legendaries, just having the ability to get multiple things at expert or an extra thing at master or whatever would be really good, without, multi-classing into a rogue or whatever, because maybe people don't want to be rogues. But yeah, that's my take on the root cause. One of the root causes of why casters are bad, and why a lot of other aspects of the game might feel bad or like rub you the wrong way. And it's because of the core tenets of how the system was built. But I think they could have done better, even while keeping those things in mind. The game could have been built for groups, but still allow solo ability of all classes. And yeah, it could have been possible if, I don't know, maybe they didn't think about it or whatever. We'll never know. Or maybe they tried doing those stuff and playtesters were wrong, which my next video, we'll get into sort of that sort of stuff. I'll touch on that sort of thing a little bit. Why I don't know if it's significant, but a portion of the people who play both 5e and PF Pathfinder 2 should really not like the mechanics because of something else they didn't like. But we'll get more into that next week. So that is all for now. Good evening.